Welcome to WLNM's original English light novel review with your host, Zeke Janguris.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to WLNM, the original English light novel review, and a podcast dedicated to promoting and discussing light novels with their authors and their fans. We also like to dive into the nitty-gritty of how authors come up with their ideas and what they think make a good novel. Now, today we welcome Voyager, the author of Extra Normal and Ghostlight Exorcist. So welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. So tell me a little bit about Ghostlight Exorcist. Is this your typical paranormal, or do you got some what's your hook? What's your twist?
So it's pretty typical. When I initially pitched it, I pitched it as Ghost Whisperer, like the Jennifer Love Hewitt Ghost Whisperer show mixed with like Men in Black, and then it's a light novel, so like throw in some anime spin of like Bleach or JJK or Demon Slayer, probably more so the outer two of those things.
Okay, but do we have Jennifer Love Hewitt's boobs?
No.
Oh, damn it. All right. Okay, sorry. Going back to the Party of 5 Days, or what was it? She was in, it wasn't Scream. Oh, I Know What You Did Last Summer.
Oh, I forgot about that movie.
Yeah. And they must have given her a wonder bra because they were very pronounced. So much so MTV was making fun of them. Yes, that dates me a little bit. So, all right, you're creating a world that you've tried to blend a lot of these. Sounds like some action and some classic medium style mixing of ghosts. So give me a setting. What's our world like? Are we dealing with a modern setting? Is this where do you take us?
Yeah, so it takes place primarily in like a modern day Japan. The main character's name is Kamimura Kitsu. They also have this spirit world is like an extra layer over our world. They have like the near side is where the spirit world and the material world kind of mesh together more fluidly, and there's the far side, which is the more fantastical aspect. It's removed from everything. It's where you can easily see that you are in some almost alien place. But yeah, it's a very modern setting. The main character is a typical high school student until she isn't. And everything around them is normal until it's not, pretty much. Yeah.
That goes for a lot of us. Everything's around us and it's normal, and then it's not. So kind of like a liminal space between like thinking in Spirited Away, when that space between her being in that little town in the beginning and then going to the hot springs house where it is definitely in the other world.
Yeah, with Spirited Away, it kind of always reminded me of like a more spiritual version of Alice in Wonderland.
Yeah.
Whereas like it's a very similar experience. Yeah. So you can go there, you see all these yokai and other things are in there that are not like traditional yokai in the sense of like the mythologies and whatnot. Like some stuff I just make up. They also have like more traditional demons. They have like corrupted ghosts and whatnot. But yeah, it's a whole other world.
So have you always been drawn to these kinds of stories?
You know what? No. So yeah, I mentioned a second ago that the pitch was that like, I throw in a little bit of like Bleach, JJK, Demon Slayer. I don't really tend to gravitate towards these supernaturally kind of stories at all. I don't really know what compelled me to make the story about that particularly, but I found it really interesting. I do like mythology. So I do like, stories of gods and devils and Greek mythology, Norse mythology, Egyptian mythology, Japanese mythology, Shinto mythology, all of that. I love all of that. But like in terms of the actual like supernatural stories, I don't usually gravitate towards them. So I've always I was as shocked as anyone when I decided I was going to write this.
So, well, so what is your poison? What is your genre of choice?
Well, so the genre that I like the most is not weirdly the genre that I read the most. I probably read more like rom-coms than anything. Like it, like shoujo, shonen, whatever. It doesn't really matter to me.
Yeah.
I like a rom-com, but I think my favorite genre is adventure, actually. Um, and that I can mostly blame that on video games. Like I grew up with like Tales of Symphonia and things like that. I like grand quests. So, Avatar, The Last Airbender, that sort of thing. And that's not what this is at all. I have other things that are in that vein. But this is a bit more of a semi-contained story. And so that was the other thing that, like, when I told some of my friends that this is the thing I was doing and they started reading it, it's like, this is not at all what I expected it to be. And I was like, yeah, I didn't expect it either.
So, it, you obviously you've made this step outside of your comfort zone. What was the hard part of doing that? Because a lot of us write, they say, write what you know. And then so that keeps us in our little bubble. And then when you were asked to write what we don't know, it sometimes feels overwhelming because you start doing research and then you get buried under piles of books that you've only read once.
Well, there is a level of familiarity to it because in a lot of what I write, I do incorporate mythology in some sense. And mythology is somewhat baked into Ghostlight. It's not to nearly the same extent. But so there is some familiarity to it. But I think the other thing is that I went to like a creative arts school.
Okay.
And so I had to write a lot of things that I'm not generally familiar with. So stepping out of my comfort zone in that way was never anything that I was especially I didn't have a whole lot of problem with it, and I got more used to it over time anyway. Like I wrote a lot of things during my college days that I never would have thought to write about on my own. And that kind of prepared me for it. So that's a
Well,
I really have a mind space for it though now.
is this a so all right, you went to a creative arts college. So is writing and storytelling something that you've always been into, or is this something that came out of a later ambition?
I've always been making some form of story. I used to draw as a kid. Um, I still doodle every now and then. I'm not, amazing or anything like that. I'm okay, but yeah, when I was a kid, I drew a lot. When I got to about, I want to say it was second or third grade, I was watching a lot of like the Fairly Odd Parents, and there was this magazine that Fairly Odd Parents had like a special episode. It was like they were all superheroes, and it was parodies of like Spider-Man and the X-Men and all that, because it was when those movies were coming out, I guess. And uh, the magazine had in it like a way to like fold paper and bind them and make a little like do it yourself comic book, and I started doing that a lot when I was younger. And I got older and I kept doing art, and then I went to school for writing because, okay, well, art is one thing, but you still need to know how to make a story. And so yeah, that's where it comes from. I've always made stories, but understanding stories and what makes a story and how stories function is where I went to school for.
So what did you learn about telling those stories? What did you go in thinking that you knew and then coming out realizing, wow, I had no idea I should do it that way?
Well, I think I went to knowing what a lot of like this was before I think a lot of people really started delving into understanding the structure of story. So I went in more or less just thinking, as long as it has a beginning, a middle, and an end, we're good. Um, and like obviously there's more to it than that, but like the general idea I had was there's a beginning where the hero, acquires the ability to do the thing they always want. There's the middle where a bunch of bad things happen that they have to resolve, and there's the end where they win against whatever the threat is. That's what I thought at the time. And then of course I go into school and they're like, oh, that's not how that works at all. I mean, it's kind of how it works, but it's vastly more complicated than that. So I learned a lot about like the 3X structure and the monomyth and like different styles of storytelling, different even like regionally, because like the monomyth that we particularly in the West tend to adhere to doesn't really necessarily show up in a lot of Eastern media, for example, or at the very least not in like manga, particularly because of the way publication works in the magazines. They can't really do it that way all the time. So I learned a lot of things. My biggest thing has always been like the characters. And so one thing I really wanted was to learn how to craft better characters. And that's also something that I learned over time there, and how character arcs work, what makes them stand out, and so on.
Well, that kind of leads me to one of my questions is, so what makes a good protagonist, and what makes your protagonist in Ghostlight Exorcist an interesting protagonist?
So what makes a good protagonist? I do think that depends on the story you're trying to tell, but ultimately there has to be a change, and it doesn't have to be in the protagonist themselves. Because the protagonist, all the protagonist is there to do is drive the story along, right? Like they don't actually necessarily have to be the one who is changed by the story. They could be the one who changes the world around them, and that's more or less kind of how I tend to view these things. I grew up with a lot of like comic books and stuff, right? And then like, so you have like the difference between Spider-Man and Superman. Spider-Man is the one who does a lot of the changing because he's growing up and he's becoming more of that hero. And Superman changes the world around him just by being Superman, right? He's the inspiration. That's the distinction between Marvel and DC.
DC, exactly.
Yeah, the protagonist of Ghostlight is kind of in a middle ground. Like, I don't think characters need to always be static in that way. Like, you can have a character who is more of a flat arc character like Superman, but still has those change arcs like Spider-Man, because people are not monoliths. So even if a character is able to affect other people around them, maybe next week they go through something that is not related to what they just taught everybody previously, that they have to learn something. And that's something that I think that Kitsu gets across, is because she's 15. She has not figured out the whole world yet. And like Ghostlight is not a comedy. There's funny bits in it, but it is not like wholesale comedy. So it's not like she's Goku, right? Where she learns her thing early and then she spends the rest of it just teaching everybody else because she's, oh, so carefree. She's not. She has this sort of great responsibility kind of angle to her, where it's this line that her late father told her, and she uses it and lives by it. But there are other things that she still has to learn and figure out because she's a kid. And I think that it's important to have that where the main character is more fluid. And I think that one of the things that makes Kitsu stand out is probably the angle that she comes at the series with. She's by far the weakest character in the entire thing. And I don't really do power scaling the way something like a Dragon Ball or a Bleach or whatever does. You have your power, your air quotes power level, and that's it. It doesn't really change. You don't get stronger in that sense. They have other ways of doing that. And I wanted it to be that Kitsu's getting stronger is not equivalent to her ability to hit things harder. It's more related to how she grows as a person, which gets back into the themes of Ghostlight itself. So that's.
So you talk about developing themes and such. I was just looking at the internet, and one of my favorite memes popped up, and it's the one where you have the writer, the curtains were blue, and the literature teacher. What the artist is telling you is that they're telling you about depression and this and that, and then the writer.
I've seen
I
that.
I just want to say the curtains are blue.
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you try and tie everything together in a theme, or is it just one of those things that happens more organically? Are you, is it a knowing is half the battle at the end of the story, or is it more of a, you can kind of interpret that this is where that, growth and evolution has to happen in your life, because when you're a kid, you just don't know everything, even though you think you might.
Mm-hmm. So for me, a lot of the themes, to be perfectly honest, I have the themes laid out, and I make the characters to more or less fit the idea of the theme, the general gist of the theme. But in terms of presenting the theme, to be perfectly honest, not everything always is like, not every event that occurs, is always necessarily planned around the theme. I Sometimes it is a very organic thing, or like something they always taught was that the characters are really the ones controlling things. You're not controlling the characters. You're just inscripting what they're doing, if you've made them believable enough. And so I think that the characters kind of inform what the theme is anyway. They live out the theme whether I intend to or not. So they'll get there. But in terms of whether or not I necessarily lay it all out, and I'm like, oh yes, well this represents that and that represents this, and I don't always do. Sometimes I do that, because I do like my flowery shoujo-ish kind of writing, but it's not all the time. Sometimes I'm just like, no, the curtains are definitely just blue. uh, and I've had that with I have some of my friends read a lot of my stuff a lot, and they're like, oh, I love how this represented that, and I was like, that didn't represent anything. It was just there to say that's what was there. It's exactly what you see on the tin.
Yeah. So what you've focused a lot of time and energy in becoming a better writer, but is the process easy for you? Is this creativity is it like an unending font of stories that just keep pouring out, or do you have to sit and be like, okay, where am I going to go? What am I going to talk about?
So in terms of the ideas, it is very easy for me. I have ideas all the time. I wish I could shut them off every now and then because it makes it difficult to sleep. But in terms of the actual process of doing the writing, sometimes it's more difficult. When it comes to Ghostlight, I'm recently upgraded from doing like 1 chapter a week to 3 chapters a week. And so sometimes it can be like, okay, how in the world do I get to the thing that I need to, like, what do I need to do next? What's the next thing I have to do, right? Like, so that can kind of be an issue. But the general, just the idea that I want to convey with that particular story arc is still there. It's just the chapter itself might be kind of a struggle. But also I am someone who does like a lot of pre-planning.
Okay.
And like world building and story Bibles and all that stuff. So I don't usually have problems coming up with anything. I will occasionally be like, okay, I'm stuck. I don't know what to do with myself at the moment. And particularly though, that was only really a problem that came up when I started pumping out more Ghostlight chapters.
So what would you say your weakest area is? I mean, I know mine tends to be dialogue. I'm great at the world building, but when it comes to actual character interaction, that's my weakest point. So what do you find as your weaker points?
I'd say that I don't know whether or not this is necessarily my weakest point. People keep telling me that I'm good at it, but I don't think I'm good at it. So, but it's the description of things at times. Not that the descriptions are bad, it's just that I feel like I run out of words and things get kind of repetitive eventually. And I have a pretty decent vocabulary, but half the battle is remembering to use your vocabulary. Um, so
Hey,
so
Hemingway made a whole life career out of being very succinct and direct with everything that he wrote.
that's true. But yeah, that's probably my weakest point. I like my strongest point is probably the character interactions and whatnot, because that's the stuff I love the most. So it's the stuff that I spent the most time working on. I also, though, I was never really training to be a prose writer in the first place. I kind of taught myself that skill more or less. Like when the creative arts school I went to, most of the learning I was doing was for scripts. It was for movies and TV and video games and comic books. I only had two-ish classes that taught prose at all, and they weren't like how to write prose. They were more like how to format a story, but we're just going to use prose because it's easier than trying to teach you how to do a script.
Yes.
So that's probably where my weakest area is just like the descriptions and sometimes remembering to include more descriptions, because it's just not what I'm really trained to do. At this point, I'm better at it because I've been doing it for like 3 years, I think, 2 years. It was 2021. So yeah, 2 years, almost 3 years. And yeah.
Thinking back those 3 years, what brought you into this space to begin with? I mean, there are a lot of people who talk about, oh, I should write this. I should, but there are fewer people who actually do. And then there are very even fewer writers who are brave enough to put it out there where it can meet the world and meet criticism. So what brought you into the space to be like, yeah, I'm going to put my work out there for the world to see?
So I've never really been afraid of criticism, especially going to a creative arts school. You kind of have to get used to it because it's going to happen. But in terms of how I got into this space, as I said, I was mostly training for scripts, and I was primarily focused on comics and, well, manga, but mostly comics at the time. Actually, I didn't really stumble into manga until I was in college. I'd read manga before, I'd watched anime before, but in college is when I kind of like really started getting into it. But the short version is that art costs money. And but the other thing is, as I said, I have ideas nonstop. So if I had to sit and just let these ideas sit around in my head forever, I would go crazy. So some of them I need to put down somewhere, and I figured, okay, what can I do? So I landed on prose because I can do most of that for relatively little money. And that's kind of how I started doing Ghostlight. I mean, Ghostlight's not the first like prose thing I've written ever. In fact, I wrote Extra Normal before that, and I've written some things before Extra Normal. But the reason I got into this space though is because those two particular ideas were very anime in my head. So I was like, okay, well, what about a light novel or a web novel or whatever? And so that's kind of where I landed on these, because I didn't want them to just sit there. Extra Normal is a completely different beast because I couldn't let that one sit there. That one's a much more personal story. But this one was just like, okay, I have this cool idea I've been wanting to write for, at that time, like 2 or 3 years. And so it's time to actually do something with it. I don't want it to just be sitting there, because if I wait for an artist, nothing will ever happen. And there's a possibility that, once it's actually being written, it could get to the point where I can afford an artist and get it to be drawn into a comic or whatever, So that's essentially where it comes from, me getting into this particular space.
Yeah, I found that, we all start in different spots. I mean, there are people that don't start writing until college. There are those who start writing, when they're kids, like you said, creating your own comics, and it's all because, we're storytellers, and whether we want to tell that story via a script or whether we want to tell it in prose. I mean, those are two different approaches, but it's all the same thing. It's trying to share a piece of ourselves with the people who are out there with an audience. And it's a brave thing to do.
Yeah. I never really, for me, I never really equated it with bravery because, again, I never really had much of a problem with it. I just kind of like, it's whatever. I put it out there. If someone doesn't like it, fine. But I do think there is a bravery to it. I just don't think that I would equate myself to being brave. I think it's just that I'm kind of reckless and impatient.
Hey, is there before we wrap up, like, is there a genre that you'd like to tackle that you haven't before?
Ooh, I never even thought about that. Let me think. A genre that I'd like to tackle that I haven't. Okay, so Ghostlight is like a supernatural action thing. I do a lot of action and adventure and stuff, as I mentioned. Extra Normal is like the most psychological thing that I've done, and it's kind of sci-fi. So, like, I've never actually written like a rom-com or actually, I don't think I've written anything that's just pure comedy either. But I also don't think I'm that funny, so maybe that's for the best. But yeah,
we all take stabs at things. I'm pretty sure I use Google Docs, and so I've got like 1,000, dozens of files of stories that are partially written where I've experimented and been like, oh, this would be an interesting idea. Let's see how far I can take it. And then, usually you get so far in, and then another idea hits you, and you're
that's the funny thing. Yeah, that's the funny thing about it, because like I actually have attempted to write comedies before, but because of the way my brain works, they don't stay comedies for very long. So like, there's this other project I can't speak in great detail about, but me and my team were writing it, and it started out as just this silly little comedy parody kind of thing. And then maybe 2 arcs in, something happens. It's like, oh, I guess this is a serious story now. Like, it happens to be funny. I can't do it, and my friends laugh at me because it's always me. It's my fault every single time. Like, they have no problem writing just full on balls to the wall comedy. I can't do it. I've tried so much.
It's though it is important to have those other writers around you to bounce those ideas off of, and I envy people that have that. My wife has been my number one bouncer off person, and it only has one big weakness: she's not creative at all. Aww. Like she if you want nuts and bolts stuff like technical writing, she's your girl. Yeah. But if you want her to come up with a story off the top of her head, it's not going to happen. So she's a good sounding board, but she can't really give that much input. So I envy those who have a circle of writers around them, because it's tough to grow as a writer without getting that feedback.
True. Oh, for real. That feedback is so important. I know a lot of people shy away from it, which is probably where that bravery thing comes in that you were talking about. But it is actually very important to actually have people around you who can just give you the bottom line up front, like, this was not very good, or this was amazing, do more of it. I'm very grateful that I have people around me who will actually read the things that I'm producing and tell me if they think it actually worked or not.
Well, that sounds a very positive and very good way of thinking about criticisms and critiques, because you can't be too thin-skinned when you're putting what you create out there for others to look at and intentionally criticize, because writers can be really critical of each other.
I've also been I have been the critic before. So like, if you can't, take it, don't dish it.
Yeah.
Kind of. So it would be hypocritical for me to be like, this isn't very good, and then be like, hey, well, what are you talking about? My story is the best thing ever. It would not be a good look.
No. Anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up today?
Oh man, it's I'm good.
All right.
It was fun talking about this. I don't get the chance to very often.
Hey, that's one of the reasons I'm here, is because I like talking to writers. It's my way of contributing to the light novel community, and I just wish the best for you guys as you put your work out there. So, thank you, Voyager. Your project is ambitious. I know you've got some other irons in the fire, which is great. So, we'll keep updated on that. And to all of you who are listening, thank you. To those of you who are new to the review, please hit the like and subscribe. It helps the algorithm decide to put this episode in front of new listeners. And by doing that, you help grow the OELN community. And so, until next time, for WLNM, the OELN review, I'm Zeke Changers, and keep reading.
This has been a WLNM podcast.